Instead of the cinema, the crowds would watch the gladiators battle things out by clashing swords. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre premiered in Austin, Texas, October 1st, 1974. She dreams of the disfigured man who attacks her. That's what the Scream franchise did to the slasher film. The horror film has been a staple in the world of cinema since the early days of silent film. But things have come a long way since the likes of The Haunted Castle, La Inferno, and Nosferatu. Today, there are so many horror subgenres that it's tough to keep track. Zombies, ghosts, and aliens are all things that scare us, all under the umbrella of horror. Horror can make us laugh, disgusted, scared, or just plain freaked out. That's what makes it such a rich and diverse genre. We're going to take a deeper dive into some of the subgenres that make up what we call horror movies, as well as give our take on some of our favorites. The slasher film is a must for any serious horror fan, and without an old VHS or DVD copy of A Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, one can only be left with a sad and incomplete collection of trite and meaningless imitations. The name coming from the excessive amounts of blood and guts that would come from a villain chasing and often slashing unsuspecting victims. Although the slasher film was the preferred way to be scared in the 70s and 80s, its beginnings go way further back, like back to the ancient world. The thirst for blood and guts can be seen as far back as ancient Rome. No one heard of a movie back then, but their desire to witness carnage was more than a match to the tastes of the modern horror fan. Instead of the cinema, the crowds would watch the gladiators battle things out by clashing swords. The arena of the gladiator was where people would go to watch competitors meet a gruesome end. In fact, the Greek word for arena is agona, where we derive the word agony. Although the origin of the games is hotly debated, the gladiator events were immensely popular. The Colosseum would seat as many as 18,000 attendees, all of whom had a taste for blood. They would play music in between bouts or at resting periods of the fighters to build up anticipation, literally providing a soundtrack for the carnage to come. Popular gladiators would know how to work a crowd and fuel the excitement of the onlookers. Eventually, the gladiators' arena faded away due to the enormous costs of keeping the industry afloat and the eventual legal problems that arose from such a gruesome display of vulgarity. We would have to wait until the late 1800s to visit the next chapter in a theatrical obsession with blood and guts, leading to the slasher films that we know and love. The Theatre Du Grand Guignol was founded in 1897. The most famous performances were the horror plays. The scenes were gory and heavy on special effects. One play, Le Laboratoire des Hallucinations, was a tale about a doctor who performs brain surgery on his wife's lover, rendering him into a zombie. The zombie rises and hammers a chisel into the doctor's brain. Audiences loved the dark and naturalistic appeal of the shows. Rather than focus on the supernatural, they focused on things like insanity, mad scientists, and gruesome slaughter. People would rent boxes that were closer to the stage, and for a time, the theater advertised that there would be doctors at the show, a clever marketing ploy to sell the possibility that the horrors they witnessed might possibly be a fine line between reality and fiction. The Theatre Du Grand Guignol eventually faded away after World War II, but the human desire to confront and witness the terror of gore and excess was far from satisfied. Luckily for horror-goers, the film industry was beginning to take up the tradition of eliciting screams from an audience trapped inside of a dark theater. 13 Women is a 1932 American psychological thriller film, produced by David O. Selznick and directed by George Archambault. It stars Myrna Loy, Irene Dunne, and Ricardo Cortez. The film is based on the 1930 best-selling novel of the same name by Tiffany Thayer, although the film had 11 women and not 13 due to editing 2 of the characters out in the final version. One of the earliest predecessors to the slasher film, 13 Women was dark, tackling such issues as the occult, murder, suicide, and the horror trope of the final girl outliving the rest of the cast. 13 Women who were sorority sisters at an all-girls college at St. Albans, all write to a clairvoyant swami by mail. Each sends a horoscope foreseeing swift doom. However, the clairvoyant is under the sway of Ursula Georgi, a half-Javanese Eurasian woman who was snubbed at school by the other women owing to her mixed-race heritage, behavior which eventually forced her to leave school. Now she seeks revenge by manipulating the women into killing themselves or each other. She also goads the clairvoyant into killing himself by falling into the path of a subway train. The film was made during pre-Code Hollywood. The Code, or Motion Picture Production Code Censorship Guidelines, commonly known as the Hays Code, was a set of censorship guidelines in an attempt to keep the morals of Hollywood in check. Things like sexual relations outside of marriage could not be portrayed in a favorable light, and anyone committing a crime had to be punished, and authority figures had to be shown in a favorable light and never as a villain. The purpose was to draw clear lines of good and evil, and to protect the morals of a young and influential audience from the divisive and diabolical hands of cinematic ne'er-dwellers. They were pioneers who pushed every limit they could in a test of creativity and progress. One of those films found a way to bridge those unsavory topics and still remain within the confines of Hollywood's censorship structure. It's hard to think of the history of slasher films without the movie Psycho. Directed by Alfred Hitchcock in 1960, the film was groundbreaking on many levels. Hitchcock had a hard time finding anyone to fund his film due to the intensity of the subject matter, so he paid for the film himself, cutting every corner he could. In 1960, shooting in color was expensive, requiring an elaborate process known as Technicolor. The cost of shooting in color was approximately 4 times the cost of black and white. A filmmaker with a low budget could save a ton of cash simply by shooting in black and white. To counter the studio's refusal to pay for the film, Hitchcock offered to personally finance it as well as forego his usual director's fee. Instead, he asked for a 60% stake in the negative. The story takes place when a real estate secretary named Marion Crane steals $40,000 to pay for her boyfriend's debts so they can get married. Marion and her boyfriend Sam secretly meet at a hotel to engage in activities only reserved for married couples on the silver screen. Frustrated by Sam's reluctance to marry her due to the large debts he owes, Marion thinks fast when the opportunity presents itself. She is charged with disposing of a large sum of cash into the bank from her employer. Marion grabs the money and then runs away, purchasing a car with her newfound reserve of dirty, stolen capital. In accordance with the production code, Marion's dark and nefarious deeds would not go unpunished. On a dark and stormy night, she takes refuge in an off-the-road motel. Here she is greeted by Norman, a clerk working at the motel for his ailing and overpowering mother. Norman invites Marion to join him for sandwiches. Although he's polite, he gets a bit agitated when Marion asks him about his mother. He tells her she is mentally ill and he is her caretaker. Marion retreats back to her room where she indulges in a hot shower. As she stands under the pouring showerhead, a figure can be seen entering the bathroom. It's Norman's mother. Flinging open the shower curtain, Marion is stabbed to death by a knife-wielding, gray-haired maniac with a disposition to solve problems with violence. Norman finds the body, and then in an effort to protect his mother, disposes of it along with Marion's car into a nearby swamp. Back home, Marion's absence is noticed. The 40 grand is lost, and a private investigator named Arbogast is hired. Arbogast is able to trace Marion's steps to the Bates Motel. Asking Norman questions doesn't satisfy him, so he goes up to the house in order to talk to his mother. He enters without a warrant and is attacked by the same knife-wielding maniac. As he's stabbed, he loses his balance and then falls down the steps, dying on the floor. With Arbogast now missing, Marion's sister Lila enlists Sam to help her find her missing sister. Following Arbogast's trail, they're led back to the house, once again questioning Norman. Lila is able to get into the house, and searching in the basement, she uncovers a corpse of a woman with similar hair to the killer. A noise is heard. It's the mother, charging towards Lila with the same knife. It is not the mother, but Norman. Things just got more crazy, but before Norman can carve her up, Sam and the police burst into the room, saving her and finally catching the psycho the film is named after. The film went on to be the second highest grossing film of 1960, behind Spartacus. Although it initially received mixed reviews, with some critics calling it a gimmick or a blot on an otherwise great career, there were many who did like the film and lauded its praises, including the Academy of Motion Pictures. The film was nominated for 4 Oscars: Best Director, Best Supporting Actress, Best Black and White Cinematography, and Best Black and White Art Direction. Perhaps his most recognized work, Psycho is considered by many to be Alfred Hitchcock's greatest, if not his most memorable film. Psycho not only brought the slasher film to the public, but legitimized the genre, inspiring horror films for decades to come. 14 years later, knives would prove to be inferior to the terror of being chased by a gas-powered chainsaw. In 1974, filmmaker Tobe Hooper set out to make his legendary film about a chainsaw-wielding maniac living in a remote rural Texas. Hooper produced the film for less than $140,000 and had a difficult time finding distribution for the film due to the graphic nature of the movie. It was eventually acquired by Bryanston Distributing Company. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre premiered in Austin, Texas on October 1st, 1974, almost a year after filming concluded. It screened nationally in the United States as a Saturday afternoon matinee, and its false marketing as a true story helped it attract a broad audience. In San Francisco, cinemagoers walked out of theaters in disgust, and in February 1976, 2 theaters in Ottawa, Canada, were advised by local police to withdraw the film, lest they face morality charges. Nonetheless, the film grossed more than $30 million in the US and Canada, receiving both positive and negative reviews from critics. The film was actually light on gore, with much of the violence being implied, although the implications themselves were terrifying. The story begins with 5 teenagers driving in a van: Sally Hardesty, Jerry, Pam, Kirk, and Sally's paraplegic brother Franklin. After visiting a cemetery, they pick up a hitchhiker who tells them about his family who works at a local slaughterhouse. The guy is weird and gives off major creepy vibes. He takes a Polaroid photo of the group and demands money. When they refuse, he cuts Franklin with a straight razor. The group manages to get him out of the car and drive away, but they are low on gas. After they stop at a gas station, the creepy attendant tells them that they are also out of gas. After some exploring, they stumble upon a farmhouse that has a generator. The group splits up to ask the residents for gas. However, what they find is a family of maniacs, one of them being the hitchhiker. The most terrifying being a large chainsaw-wielding character wearing skin as a mask, known as Leatherface. Leatherface kills off all the teenagers but one, Sally. Sally follows the final girl trope in slasher films, and since she is the only one left, she has to get away. After being captured and bound by the family members, Sally escapes, but is chased by Leatherface and the brothers. An oncoming truck accidentally runs over the hitchhiker, killing him. The truck driver attacks Leatherface with a large wrench, causing him to fall and injure his leg with a chainsaw. Sally, who's covered in blood, flags down a passing pickup truck and climbs into the bed, narrowly escaping Leatherface. As the pickup drives away, Sally laughs hysterically while an enraged Leatherface swings his chainsaw on the road as the sun rises behind him. The film grossed more than $30 million in the US and Canada. The film was actually light on gore, with much of the violence being implied, although the implications themselves were terrifying. But just a few years later, on Halloween night, another masked, blade-wielding maniac would rear his ugly head again. Although the Texas Chainsaw Massacre introduced the classic slasher villain, it came to life in John Carpenter's Halloween. Released on Halloween in 1978, the film was an instant success. Having a budget of just over $300,000, the film is one of the most profitable independent horror films ever made. Independent film producer Irwin Yodlins and financier Mustafa Akkad sought out Carpenter to direct a film for them about a psychotic killer that stalked babysitters. Carpenter agreed to direct the film contingent on his having full creative control, and was paid $10,000 for his work, which included writing, directing, and scoring the film. He and his then-girlfriend Deborah Hill began drafting the story of Halloween. The film's villain is Michael Myers, who on Halloween night in 1968 brutally murdered his sister with a butcher knife when he was just 6 years old. 12 years later, while in the care of his doctor, Dr. Loomis, he escapes a mental hospital and steals a car, heading back to his hometown of fictional Haddonfield, Illinois. When he arrives, he sees a young girl, Laurie Strode, drop off a key in his childhood home. Michael then begins stalking Laurie, and one by one begins killing her teenage friends until finally coming after Laurie. Laurie is played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who happens to be the daughter of Janet Leigh, who played Marion in Psycho. The film has other nods to Hitchcock. Dr. Loomis is named after Sam Loomis in Psycho, and Tommy Doyle is named after Thomas Doyle from Rear Window, another Hitchcock film. Michael catches up with Laurie, chasing her throughout the neighborhood. He survives being stabbed, but still seems to get back up. The film's theme, the evil cannot be killed, is ever present. Finally, she is cornered inside of the house when Dr. Loomis comes in and shoots Michael, and he falls from a second-floor balcony. It seems as though the crisis is over. That is, until they look in the yard where Michael has fallen, and he's gone. Halloween went on to gross $70 million in the box office and is widely praised for John Carpenter's vision of the franchise. Many sequels and remakes were made, proving the film's longevity and its place in the historical narrative of film history. But its biggest contribution may be the influence it had on other filmmakers. One in particular would center around another holiday, capitalizing on triskaidekaphobia with a fear of Friday the 13th. In the late 1970s, filmmaker Sean S. Cunningham, inspired by John Carpenter's Halloween, wanted to make a film that was shocking, visually stunning, and would make you jump out of your seat. The screenplay for Friday the 13th was completed in 1979 by writer Victor Miller, and Cunningham was ready to make the film. The camp scenes were shot on a working Boy Scout camp, Camp No Bibosco, which is located in Hardwick. The story begins with a flashback to 1958 at Camp Crystal Lake, a summer camp for young kids looking for adventure. While the group is singing songs at a fireplace, two of the camp counselors sneak off to do the dirty deed. Just as things are getting heated, a killer enters and murders both of them. It turns out that while the pair would frequently sneak off, a young child drowned and the killer was taking revenge. 20 years later, the camp is rebuilt with a fresh batch of kids and counselors with difficulties controlling their hormones. One by one, people are getting murdered at the camp. Oftentimes, the camera angle is the POV of the killer, adding to the mystery of the killer's identity. The killer then reveals herself. Mrs. Voorhees, a middle-aged woman who claims to be a friend of Steve, arrives. She reveals that her son Jason was the young boy who drowned in 1957, and she blames his death on the neglect by the counselors because they were too busy doing the horizontal hokey pokey instead of supervising him. Revealing herself as the killer, she attempts to kill Alice. At the shore, they struggle until Alice is able to decapitate her with a machete. Exhausted, Alice falls asleep inside a canoe that floats out on Crystal Lake. When she awakes, Jason's decomposing corpse emerges from the lake and drags her underwater. On just a $550,000 budget, Friday the 13th grossed nearly $60 million at the box office, which would be around $117 million in today's spending power. Some critics were harsh on the initial film, but no one could deny that the fans just couldn't get enough. The second film introduced Jason as the primary villain, taking on the mantles of his mother's bloodthirsty killing spree. In the third film, Jason dons the infamous hockey mask, an image that would live forever as an icon of the slasher film villain. Jason's mask and machete would terrify the lives of promiscuous camp-going youths for decades. But it was through the dreams of another villain that a nightmare would become reality. Filmmaker Wes Craven developed the concept for A Nightmare on Elm Street from real-life events in his childhood. He read a series of articles about men from Southeast Asia who were immigrant families and had died in the middle of nightmares. The condition afflicted men between the ages of 19 and 57 and was believed to be sudden unexplained death syndrome, or Brugada syndrome, or both. Wes was bullied in school by a kid named Fred Krueger, also the name of the film's villain, Freddy Krueger. The story begins by observing a heavy-breathing man building a glove made of knives. It then cuts to Tina, a high school student having a nightmare. She's being chased by a disfigured man with a glove made of knives, the same character we just saw. She wakes up from the dream only to see that her nightgown has been slashed in 4 places. When she goes to school, she meets her boyfriend Rod, her best friend Nancy, and her boyfriend Glenn. Nancy, Tina, and Glenn discover that they have all been having the same nightmares with the same disfigured character. During a sleepover at Tina's house, Tina's boyfriend, Rod Lane, arrives late, and him and Tina go upstairs to the bedroom. When Tina falls asleep, she dreams of the disfigured man who attacks her. In real life, Rod sees her fatally slashed by an unseen force, forcing him to flee. Nancy and Glenn find Tina's body covered in blood and sliced open. Rod is nowhere to be found, at least until he is caught by the police. Nancy continues to have nightmares with the disfigured man, and while sleeping she sees him enter Rod's jail cell. Rod is found dead, appearing to have committed suicide. Her mother is concerned about her nightmares and takes her to a sleep disorder clinic, where they sedate Nancy into sleep for observation. Things get real sciencey here, and the doctor tells her mother that the numbers on the screen should never get past 5 or 6. When they shoot up past 21 and Nancy is convulsing, the team rushes in to wake her. Nancy has a streak of gray hair from the trauma. She reveals a fedora hat that she grabbed from the man in her dream. It seems as though she can pull objects out of her dreams. In a confrontation with her mother, she reveals to Nancy that the man in her dreams is Fred Krueger, a child murderer that the parents of Elm Street murdered by burning him alive in his boiler room. Nancy's mom takes her downstairs to show her the glove they took from him, the same one in her dreams. Now that Nancy knows who he is, she has a plan. She's going to fall asleep, and when her boyfriend Glenn wakes up, she'll pull Freddy out of her dream, and then they can trap him. The plan fails, however, when Glenn falls asleep and is killed by Freddy in a bloody and gruesome manner that pushed the boundaries of creativity and special effects. In spite of all her trauma, Nancy must press on. She sets booby traps all around the house, and the plan is still to wake up and bring Freddy into the real world. This time, she asks her dad, also a police officer, to help. He is across the street at Glenn's house, investigating Glenn's untimely demise. Nancy goes into her dream, and then brings Freddy into the real world. As she runs through the house and Freddy chases her, he gets banged up by the various traps that she set. Finally, she sets him on fire in the basement and runs to call her dad. When he enters the house, they find Freddy upstairs, attacking Nancy's mom. The two disappear into the bed. Nancy is then left alone when Freddy returns. Nancy turns her back on him, and Freddy loses his power when Nancy is no longer afraid. At the end of the film, Nancy is fine, her mom is alive. As Nancy drives away with her friends, the convertible they are driving is colored like Freddy's red and green sweater. It drives away with the teens screaming. A Nightmare on Elm Street premiered in the United States with a limited theatrical release on November 9th, 1984, opening in 165 cinemas across the country. The film eventually earned a total of $25 million at the US and Canadian box office and $57 million worldwide. The film went on to become a franchise, with 4 sequels being produced, including Freddy vs. Jason, a crossover film between the Nightmare and Friday the 13th franchises. A Nightmare on Elm Street solidified the slasher horror films of the 1980s and inspired horror aficionados to recognize its contribution to the genre. But it was Wes Craven himself who would once again take the slasher film to the next level, this time in the late 90s, speaking to the next generation in an equally impactful manner. Once slasher films became a series of predictable tropes, they were easy to make fun of, and they lost their terror and edgy disposition. But what if you could acknowledge the tropes and make that part of the story? That's what the Scream franchise did to the slasher film. Scream was written by Kevin Williamson, who drew inspiration from reports of a series of murders by the Gainesville Ripper, as he wrote a screenplay that satirized the cliches of the slasher genre popularized in such films as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Developed under the title Scary Movie, Williamson's script became the subject of an intense bidding war from multiple studios before Miramax Films finally purchased the rights. The studio was able to recruit Wes Craven to direct the film, and also acquired stars like David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, Matthew Lillard, Rose McGowan, Skeet Ulrich, and Drew Barrymore. Produced on a budget of just $15 million, Scream was released on December 20th, 1996, and drew in over $175 million at the box office, making it one of the most profitable films of that time. The story begins with a phone call, answered by a teenage girl played by Drew Barrymore. The conversation revolves around scary movies and quickly turns sour when the caller becomes angry and threatening. He tells her that her boyfriend is outside and bound. She looks out and she can see that he is indeed outside. In bursts the caller with a knife where the girl is murdered, borrowing a page from Hitchcock's book on killing off a Billed star early in the film. The killer then turns his attention to Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell. Sidney's mother was murdered years ago, and it is believed they caught the killer. On the 1-year anniversary of her mother's death, she receives a call from Ghostface, taunting her about her mother. Ghostface then attacks her in her house, and she runs away before her boyfriend Billy Loomis, another nod to Hitchcock, who had a character named Sam Loomis, enters. Sidney is suspicious, and the police come and arrest Billy. Billy is released and cleared of charges, and in lieu of the recent murders, the principal gives students the day off. So what would any group of teenagers do in a situation like this? Throw a party. One of the students, Stu, throws the festivity at his house. While at the party, a cinephile named Randy discusses the rules of any horror movie. You may not survive the movie if you have sex. You may not survive the movie if you drink or do drugs. You may not survive the movie if you say, "I'll be right back," "Hello," or "Who's there?" As if on cue, Sidney's boyfriend Billy shows up at the party, and the two rush upstairs to violate rule number 1. Just as they're done, Ghostface attacks, stabbing Billy. Sidney runs back into the house where Stu and Billy are together. They confess to Sidney that both of them are the Ghostface killer. Billy's dad and Sidney's mom had an affair, resulting in his parents' divorce. This made Billy so angry that he killed her and framed Cotton Weary, the man wrongfully convicted of the murder of Sidney's mom. The plan was always to kill Sidney, frame her dad for her murder, and all of the other murders by Ghostface. Suddenly, Gail runs in and a struggle ensues. Stu dies when a TV falls on his head, and finally Billy is shot by Gail, ending the pair's career of serial killing. Scream is regarded as one of the best slasher films of all time. Studios rushed to capitalize on Scream's success with teen-centric horror films and television series leading into the 2000s, such as I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, and Cherry Falls. The film itself became a franchise, and 5 more sequels were produced, making it one of the most successful horror franchises to date. The slasher film is a classic in the spectrum of subgenres that make up horror films, and our suspicion is there will be many more made that will scare